A character that hates the player controlling them probably sounds like a horrible idea, but Kris, the protagonist of Deltarune, somehow manages to get the player to like them regardless, which is strange because throughout the game many other characters go through very similar situations, each of which gets resolved by the characters forming a genuine bond, which by all means should make you jealous. So you can imagine how surprised I was to learn that it's seeing those desires be fulfilled in others that somehow causes players to connect with Kris. That's why today I'd like to take you through some of those character dynamics, and spoilers, the final one gets kinda creepy. With that in mind, let me introduce you to Spamton, a washed up salesman who was once obsessed with becoming a big shot. Now real quick, if you've already played Deltarune, then feel free to skip ahead to the timestamp shown on screen, as I'll just quickly be covering some of the basics. Deltarune takes place in the light and dark world. These worlds must coexist in perfect balance in order to prevent the destruction of everything. However, recently, dark fountains, gateways connecting these two worlds, have started to appear, and as a result have disrupted that balance. It's your goal as the player to enter the dark world through these dark fountains to stop an otherwise inevitable destruction. But for our topic in particular, the exact way these dark fountains are opened is very important, because this only ever happens when someone with great determination chooses to do so. Okay, but what does this have to do with Spamton? Well, Spamton lives in the dark world, and through his dialogue we learn that something about him is clearly broken. His words get mixed up all the time, and it's almost like he's trying to describe Kris in a way that he's actually just describing his own difficult past through him instead. But let's look at that dialogue a bit closer. All your friends abandoned you for the slime. You are, and if you've lost control of your life, then you've just gotta grab it by the silly strings. Combining the loss of control of Spamton's correlation to strings, it's likely that he sees himself as a puppet under someone else's control. And well, Kris is just the same, that the player controlling them forces Kris to do things against their own free will. But here's the thing, if you dig into what happened to Spamton, you find out that he only sees himself that way because someone in his past pressured him into making decisions he never wanted to make, meaning that unlike Kris, Spamton still has the physical ability to choose what he wants to do, and only sees himself as a puppet because others have changed his view of what freedom really is. Which matters, because as we approach the end of this part of his story, we see him ask the player to transfer his existence into a machine, and the moment you do so, Spamton is overjoyed. Bigger and better than ever. This power is freedom. I won't have to be just a puppet anymore. Spamton's attempt at freeing himself from his own internal conflict was to gain more power, but it's this exact mindset that turned him into the exact thing he was trying to escape, because not long after does he notice that his new body is held up by literal strings. And while there's nothing that confirms exactly why these strings appear, dark worlds seem to take shape around whoever opens them, in that everyone and everything inside it represents some sort of shared idea, which raises the possibility that this one is telling us something about Spamton's idea of freedom, that gaining more power can actually make you less free. But more importantly, it also connects back to you as the player, which makes sense when you consider that throughout the game, Kris attempts to tear your soul out of their body, the soul in this case being what represents you, the player. And whenever they stay without it for too long, they turn sickly and can barely move, just like how Spamton's own movement ends up being limited by his strings. But it's also not like you chose to control Kris in the first place. I mean, at the start of the game, you were able to create your own character, only to have that vessel discarded almost immediately, with your soul instead being forced into Kris. Which also means that even if the game never explicitly gives us this objective, we're given plenty of reasons to start wanting the same thing Kris wants: freedom from the other person's control. And since the game gives us no obvious alternative to fix that problem, it's easy to imagine that finding that discarded vessel again might be the solution, which remains to be the case until you meet characters like Spamton, because their stories always seem to follow a trend where one person is torn between two conflicting desires. In this case, Spamton being torn between who he actually is and who his past convinced him he has to become. And by watching that conflict resolve, you're able to imagine what a similar solution might look like for you and Kris, one where neither of you actually stays in control, since without you, Kris would simply remain incapacitated, and without Kris, you wouldn't have a way to navigate the world. Which brings us to our next character. During the game, Kris actually still goes to school, and it's here that you meet one of their classmates, Noelle, someone who's shy, easily overwhelmed and has always struggled with standing up for herself. And you learn that a lot of that comes from her relationship with her mother, who expects her to be strong and independent, all while Noelle is still trying to figure out what she actually wants for herself. But more importantly, Kris is probably one of the most important people in her life, because they're one of the few people Noelle is able to feel comfortable around. And throughout the story, their friendship helps Noelle become more confident and willing to stand up for herself. But there's also another way this relationship can develop, because Deltarune's story can actually change quite a bit depending on what the player does in the second chapter. But first, in case you haven't done so yet, consider subscribing. At the time of making this, we're almost at 10,000 subscribers, and it would really mean a lot if you helped us reach that. In the second chapter, after getting Noelle to join your party, you unlock the ability to use her powerful ice magic. However, because of how Noelle is as a person, she actually doesn't enjoy killing enemies, and becomes increasingly more uncomfortable the more you make her kill them. Yet, if the player ignores those warnings and repeatedly forces Noelle to use her magic against them, the game starts giving you increasingly strange opportunities to push her further. More things do happen after that, but for our topic, what matters is that this whole time, the player has spent an entire section of the game deliberately forcing another person to do exactly what she doesn't want to do, which you might have already guessed is very similar to how the player is forcing Kris to do something they don't want. But there's also a big difference, because unlike Noelle, you've been controlling Kris since the beginning of the game, meaning you didn't actually know anything about them before entering their body. Whereas in the case of Noelle, we learn about her troubling past beforehand, meaning this entire time you've also been intentionally deciding to force her to be someone she isn't, which matters quite significantly, because while you do learn more about Kris as the story progresses, it's moments like these that force you to confront the exact reason why Kris hates you in the first place. In this case, through your comparison of the result of those actions to your current actions in controlling Kris, you're forced to realize that if you continue playing the game in the same way you've been doing so far, Kris will eventually become someone different as well. Or maybe they already have, because at the end of chapter 1, way before this, Kris decided to open a dark fountain of their own. And so maybe your actions during chapter 1 already pushed Kris to become someone who intentionally wishes to harm the player as well as their party. But at the same time, because you realize you're responsible for those sudden changes, you also begin to connect with Kris on a deeper level. That's enough about Noelle though, let's move on to someone else instead. That being yet another one of Kris's classmates, Berdly. While he starts out as an arrogant know-it-all, we eventually learn that a lot of that confidence comes from wanting to be recognized by the people around him, which matters because when Berdly later joins your party, the confidence he once had suddenly begins to disappear. Because during your travels with him, whenever you come across a puzzle, Berdly immediately throws himself at it, as though he's desperately trying to prove his own self-worth by being the one to solve it. But here's the thing, Berdly cannot actually solve those puzzles on his own, which obviously doesn't stop him from repeatedly trying to do so, but after failing one puzzle too many, Berdly finally admits something deeply personal. He's forced to confront the fact that the only way he managed to reach the success he has was with the help of others. And for our case, this matters quite a lot, because it's here we learn that Berdly's conflict stems from two versions of the same person who are fighting for two opposite things. One that desperately tries to be recognized by pretending to be someone he isn't, and the other who still wishes to be themselves. And so, in a way, Berdly shows you what happens when a person only gets to keep one half of themselves visible and hides the other away out of fear of what it means about them, which, if we compare that dynamic to the one connecting the player and Kris, it's easy to see what might happen if we treat Kris the same. That the more you leave one part of yourself buried, the more it begins to resent you. And now, knowing all of that, I'd like to talk to you about the final character dynamic, one that actually, as of making this video, takes place in the most recent chapter, Pink. Not only is Pink the combination of two individuals, one of those being the body Mew Mew and the other being a ghost named Maddie, but only one of them is able to take control at a time. On top of that, their biggest problem is that they absolutely hate each other, and both of them have their own reasons for wanting control over the situation. Maddie in particular has a pretty good one at that, because as it turns turns out, Pink not only resembles a character from the previous game in the franchise, Undertale, but one of her attacks is almost identical to the ghost that controlled that same other character. This ghost being the one who once controlled someone known as the Mad Dummy, only to later enter the body of Mad Mew Mew, meaning it's likely that somehow this same ghost now entered the body of Pink. And the Mad Dummy spent their entire existence furious about being treated like an object. They wanted to be recognized as their own person, rather than just a dummy that other people could use. And so when Maddie eventually finds herself in yet another similar situation, it makes sense that she's immediately hostile towards Mew Mew. In comparison, Mew Mew is the body of an anime character brought to life, one that is associated deeply with a cutesy persona, causing her desire to instead revolve more around that, which is something the player can actually experience for themselves, because Mew Mew openly expresses that she wishes to date Kris. Pink, by the way, is a secret boss fight, but within it there's also a dating mechanic which plays directly into Mew Mew's desire. And so during those moments, Mew Mew gets to pursue the kind of relationship she wants, while Maddie is forced to watch the exact opposite happen to what she desires. All while whenever Maddie takes control, Mew Mew no longer gets to act as cutesy like she wishes. But this dynamic is also once again different to the one Kris and the player revolve around, because in the case of Pink, the two characters controlling her can actually directly talk to each other. Pink can tell Maddie what she wants, and Maddie can do the same, which is why they're eventually able to come to a sort of understanding and act less hateful towards each other. And well, the player has spent the entire game wanting exactly that. Or rather, the game's been pushing you toward it unknowingly by making you experience the desires of the characters that you encounter. And at this point, you might expect Kris to do the same. Except, why would they? I mean, everything the game has told you about Kris so far seems to suggest that they only hate our control more and more as the story continues, which is why what Kris does next is rather strange. Because upon Susie, another party member of yours, telling Pink that Kris actually flirts with every enemy they come across, Kris turns directly towards the camera and holds out their hand to give you a sign of peace, which you might think is a sign of your bond increasing, but keep in mind, this isn't actually the end of the game. So what's actually going on here? Well, what if the player didn't become more attached to Kris because Kris changed? What if you became more attached because the game kept restricting your solutions that you originally thought might help fix your problem? And because the game keeps forcing you to confront more and more of the moments that restrict those solutions, it seems as though one of two things will happen. Maybe the game keeps eliminating solutions until you and Kris are left with a happy ending. But there's also a darker option, and that if you have no solutions left at all, the only thing you can do is love the version of Kris that hates you the most.